In January 2021, at a military ceremony in Connecticut, a 99-year-old man received a promotion granted 76 years earlier that had never reached him. He also received 2 medals he had earned in the war that the Army had simply never delivered. 76 years. While this man waited, without complaining, without asking, he had survived an air attack in the Philippines, a 25-mile nighttime boat crossing, a 3-mile swim in shark-infested waters, 11 days inside a dark slave ship, and more than 3 years of forced labor in copper mines in Japan. And when he was finally asked what courage meant to him after all of that, Dan Crowley answered with a simple sentence: "Courage is doing the right thing when you are called to do it." This is the story of the man who did the right thing and waited 76 years to be recognized. Daniel Crowley was born in 1922 in Greenwich, Connecticut, a quiet town where the rhythm of life was dictated by the seasons of the year. He grew up during the Great Depression, in a time that shaped an entire generation. Families learned to get by with little, to value what they had, and not to ask for anything they had not earned with sweat. It was a different America, quieter, harsher, and in a way more honest about what it cost to live. When Dan finished high school, the United States was not yet at war. The conflict devastating Europe seemed distant to a young man from Greenwich. But Dan Crowley looked to the horizon and felt the call. In October 1940, at 18 years old, he walked to the recruiting office and enlisted in the Army Air Corps. In an interview with the Veterans History Project decades later, Dan said with a smile, "I wanted to take a long trip at the country's expense, and then get out right after." It was the lightness of someone who still did not know what real war looked like. After basic training, in March 1941, Crowley received his first assignment: Nichols Field in the Philippines, one of the main American outposts in the Pacific. At that moment, the United States was not yet at war. Life was quiet: training, aircraft maintenance, routine patrols. Dan was an Air Corps man, not infantry. He had not been trained for ground combat. He did not yet know that this distinction would soon become irrelevant. The months passed with the deceptive calm of those standing on the edge of a storm without knowing it. The summer of 1941 in the Philippines was humid and hot. The base operated with the bureaucratic efficiency of peacetime. But tension grew in the headlines. Japan was expanding its presence in the Pacific. Diplomacy was showing signs of exhaustion. And at Nichols Field, Dan Crowley did what everyone else did. He waited. The waiting ended on the morning of December 8, 1941, one day after the attack on Pearl Harbor. The United States had declared war the night before. And that morning, while the news still echoed over the base radio, Japanese planes appeared on the horizon over Manila. Dan Crowley looked at the sky. There was no training that could prepare him for that moment. But there was something deeper, an instinct that did not require training. When the time came, Dan Crowley did the right thing. Japanese bombers appeared over Nichols Field with a precision that left no doubt. That attack had been planned for a long time. The sky that moments before had been blue and empty, filled with smoke, explosions, and the deafening sound of engines at full speed. Hangars exploded, aircraft caught fire before taking off. The base that Dan had called home for the past months was being systematically destroyed. He was not trained for that moment, but he was there. Crowley and his companions made a quick and improvised decision. They would not simply watch. Searching through what was available, they found British Lewis machine guns, weapons from the First World War, outdated. They welded them together to create a more powerful anti-aircraft weapon. No training in ground combat, no instruction manual, only ingenuity, determination, and the refusal to stand still while the enemy destroyed everything around them. The Japanese attack destroyed most of the base, but those men did not stay quiet. On the night of December 24, 1941, Christmas Eve, Crowley and the survivors received orders: evacuation to the Bataan Peninsula, 25 miles to the north, on the other side of Manila Bay. Sailing during the day was impossible. The Japanese controlled the skies. So they departed in the darkness of the early morning, crossing the bay in silence, without lights. It was Christmas Eve. Somewhere in the United States, families were around decorated trees. Dan Crowley was crossing a bay in the dark, heading toward a war. In Bataan, American and Filipino soldiers were reorganized. The men from Crowley's air unit were incorporated into the Provisional Air Corps Infantry Regiment. Now they were officially infantry. They fought for 3.5 months, repelling Japanese amphibious landings, holding positions under increasing pressure, watching supplies diminish and reinforcements never arrive. General MacArthur had fled to Australia with the promise to return. For the men in Bataan, that promise sounded very distant. On April 9, 1942, the American command in Bataan made a decision that Crowley never fully accepted: surrender. The order came down through the chain of command. But Dan Crowley and a group of companions had other plans. The men did not surrender, Crowley said decades later, with a clarity that left no room for interpretation. They were surrendered by their commanders to prevent a massacre. And for Dan Crowley, there was a very important difference between the two. While the rest of the American forces marched toward surrender, Dan Crowley and a group of soldiers and sailors made a different decision. They hid among the rocks of the breakwater on the coast, lying still, waiting. The Japanese were patrolling the area. Any movement would betray them. They waited for nightfall, and when darkness covered the bay, they swam. 3 miles of open ocean in shark-infested waters. The island of Corregidor was on the other side, still in American hands, still fighting. The only alternative was capture, so they swam. Some clung to debris from sunken ships. Others swam the entire distance with the sheer effort of men who had decided that capture was not an option. Dan Crowley reached the other side. Everyone who left with him reached the other side. In Corregidor, Crowley and the fugitives from Bataan were incorporated into the 4th Marines Regimental Reserve. For almost a month, they fought. The position was impossible. No reinforcements, no supplies, against an enemy that controlled the air and the sea. Corregidor held out as long as it could. On May 6, 1942, the island fell. Dan Crowley, along with approximately 1,200 American and Filipino prisoners, was captured by the Japanese. On May 25, 1942, the prisoners were forced to march through the streets of Manila. The Japanese called it a parade. The Americans called it the March of Shame. Thousands of Filipino civilians watched from the sidewalks. Some cried. Others discreetly threw food and water to the prisoners, risking their own safety. Dan Crowley marched through those streets with his head held high. The war had taken his freedom. It had not taken his dignity. After the March of Shame, Crowley was taken to the Cabanatuan prison camp, barracks surrounded by barbed wire where conditions were deliberately brutal. Little food, little water, untreated diseases, forced labor. Cabanatuan would later become the site of one of the most daring rescues of the war, when American Rangers would free the prisoners who remained. But Dan Crowley was no longer there when that happened. The Japanese had other plans for him. To escape the conditions of Cabanatuan, Crowley volunteered to work on the construction of an airstrip on Palawan Island. It was brutal labor. Using only hand tools, the prisoners dug and leveled the ground under the Philippine sun, with little food and no proper protection. But it was slightly better than confinement in the camp. Crowley spent months on that work, and when the airstrip was completed, the Japanese made a new decision about what to do with him. In March 1944, Dan Crowley was placed aboard a ship bound for Japan. What followed were 11 days he never forgot. The Japanese transported prisoners in merchant ships, with no hospital ship markings, no signs of prisoners on board. 300 men were pushed into the ship's hold. They remained there for 11 days, in darkness, with unbearable heat, lying on top of one another, with little food and almost no water. The men transporting them treated them as cargo. Dan Crowley survived 11 days under those conditions. In Japan, Crowley was taken to work in the copper mines, considered among the most dangerous assignments given to American prisoners. Underground tunnels of rock, copper dust in the air, constant accidents, extreme physical exhaustion. It was slave labor, designed to extract the maximum from each prisoner. Dan Crowley entered those mines every day for months, not knowing if he would return to the surface. He returned, and returned the next day, and the next. In August 1945, the atomic bombs of Hiroshima and Nagasaki brought an end to the war in the Pacific. Japan surrendered on August 15th. In the mines, the news arrived with a delay that felt endless. On September 4th, 1945, Dan Crowley was finally freed. He had spent 3.5 years as a prisoner of war. He had survived camps in the Philippines, a hell ship, the copper mines of Japan. Somewhere in Connecticut, his family had waited all that time. Dan Crowley returned home. He was welcomed with relief and love. He received an honorable discharge in April 1946. He went back to Connecticut, worked in the construction and jewelry industries, built a life. And at no moment did he complain about what he had been through. Not the conditions in the camps, not the mines, not even the fact that the Army had promoted him to sergeant in October 1945 without ever informing him. Dan Crowley simply moved forward, as he always had. For decades, Dan Crowley lived with the quiet of someone who does not need recognition to know what he has done. He worked, built a family, remained active in the veterans community. He visited the USS Bataan, named in honor of the battle where he had fought, several times over the years, forming friendships with the sailors on board. He was the kind of man who asked nothing from the country he had served, who was simply present, remembering, when asked, what he had been through. But there was an injustice that remained, not because Crowley had called it an injustice, but because objectively it was. The Army had promoted Dan Crowley to sergeant in October 1945. The promotion was processed. It existed in the records, but the document never arrived, because he had been discharged before the paperwork was completed. For 76 years, Dan Crowley lived as a soldier who had fought in Bataan, survived hell, and was never formally recognized for the promotion, nor for the decorations he had earned in combat. The system had simply forgotten. The change came thanks to the American Defenders of Bataan and Corregidor Memorial Society, an organization that fights for recognition of Pacific veterans. They researched Crowley's records, found the promotion, found the decorations, and worked with the Secretary of the Army to correct what should never have remained unresolved. On January 4, 2021, at a ceremony at Bradley Air National Guard Base in Windsor Locks, Connecticut, the United States finally settled its account with Dan Crowley. Gregory Slavonic, acting Undersecretary of the Navy, said, "The validity and professionalism demonstrated by you, Dan, have secured you a permanent place in the heart of every American." That morning, Dan Crowley received 3 things he had earned 76 years earlier: the Sergeant Stripes, the promotion that had never been delivered, the Prisoner of War Medal for 3.5 years of captivity, and the Combat Infantryman Badge for combat in Nichols Field, in Bataan, and in Corregidor. He received each one with the calm of someone who had already learned not to expect anything. He was 99 years old. He was standing. He was lucid. And when asked what he felt, he answered with the same simple sentence: "Courage is doing the right thing when you are called to do it." Dan Crowley passed away a few months later at his home in Simsbury, Connecticut, at the age of 99. He had waited 76 years for recognition he had never asked for and never demanded. And when it finally came, he received it with the same quiet dignity with which he had swum 3 miles in shark-infested waters, survived a hell ship, and worked in the mines of Japan. Without noise, without complaints, doing the right thing, because that was what the moment required. If you believe stories like Dan Crowley's deserve to be remembered, subscribe. There is much more to come.